Welcome back, everybody. My name is Tucker, and today's video is another episode of NBA Trade Machine, and this one focuses on Andrew Wiggins. Now, really quickly, before we get started, I want to give a huge shout out to you guys for all the support on the Russell Westbrook Trade Machine video. It did super well. There were a ton of comments and likes and stuff, and you guys just did an amazing job of supporting that video. So thank you so much for that. I look forward to continuing to doing these. And some of you guys took this seriously and some didn't. I really actually wanted Andrew Wiggins trade ideas because it's one of the more difficult things to come up with across the league. And some of you guys were making jokes, but a lot of you guys actually gave me some good ideas. So we're going to go over some of those here. And then I have one of my own as well. So let's go ahead and get started. And the first trade to talk about is from Jace, and it is the Detroit Pistons getting Andrew Wiggins. And it's Tony Snell, Langston Galloway, and Thon Maker to the Timberwolves in exchange for Andrew Wiggins. And the Pistons also send a future first. And the Pistons are another team, like we talked about this with the Russell Westbrook thing. They're probably, if they're going to get better, they're going to have to take on a player with a bad contract because they don't have any other cap space to really make moves, and they have a couple of expirings that they could potentially use in a trade. And this is one of really the only ways that they can still improve their team, because we're all in agreement that Andrew Wiggins is not on a very good contract, but he does probably still have some potential left in there for a team to tap into, and in this case the team being the Pistons. They give up the expiring contracts of Galloway and then Maker, but Maker's also could be kind of a future asset as well, someone that could end up being good. The Tony Snell contract is a 2-year expiring, so still has 2 years left on it. And then the Timberwolves also get a future first, because the idea here for Minnesota essentially is just to get out from under Wiggins' contract. Like, they've tried the experiment, they can't figure out what it's going to take for him to develop into a really good player. They overpaid him, they know it, and they want to create max cap space for next summer for some reason. And so at least they get out from under a lot of his salary, except for about the $10 million that Tony Snell will be making next year. So this makes sense for both sides. And again, just like the Westbrook thing, I don't really think that they're going to get a ton of value in return for Wiggins just because of the contract situation. So maybe some of you guys think that some of these trades don't give back nearly enough value to Minnesota, but that's going to be a theme throughout the video. Next up now is a trade that I came up with, and it involves getting Andrew Wiggins on the Memphis Grizzlies. And the trade is Wiggins to the Grizzlies in exchange for Josh Jackson, Solomon Hill, Dwight Howard, plus one of the second-round picks that Memphis just got from the Dallas Mavericks in the DeLon Wright trade. And the thinking here is that the Grizzlies get a relatively high upside, at least a player still with some potential to help them on the wing, in exchange for basically just expiring contracts, a second-round pick, and then whatever small potential Josh Jackson still has. The Timberwolves get out from under almost all of Wiggins' money, with the exception of what Josh Jackson will be making over the next couple of years, but they can always let him go if he doesn't really develop. And that's really the future value for them, is whatever potential Josh Jackson still has, plus a second-round pick. And it's a bit of a risky move for the Grizzlies because it does tie up so much of their cap space, but they need a good player on the wing, and it just gives them another, nice young asset that could potentially turn into something despite the awful contract. Again, they're going to have cap space over the next couple of years, but maybe this is the way to use it, by buying low on a player with a bad contract rather than trying to use their cap space on big free agents. I think it would be interesting to see him in Memphis in a new place. Maybe that is all he needs to kind of turn his career around Jaren Jackson Jr. and around Ja Morant, put some shooters around those guys and see what happens, even though, like I said, his contract is awful. You're really not giving up that much except for the cap space that he takes up. Next up, Jeremy says the Minnesota Timberwolves would get Tim Hardaway Jr. and Courtney Lee in exchange for Andrew Wiggins, and he says the Wolves would give up a 2020 second-round pick as well. I would probably flip that, where the Mavs would give up a second-round pick just so that the Timberwolves are getting something out of this other than just salary relief, because both Courtney Lee and Tim Hardaway Jr. are expiring contracts, so they get out from under that money. Hardaway Jr. can help them this year as a player and on the court, can make some shots for them if that's something that they're looking for out of a Wiggins deal. And then again, with the Mavs, it's a similar situation to the Grizzlies. They've used up a lot of their cap space in this case, whereas the Grizzlies have cap space, but they're not really going to be able to use it too much in free agency. And it's just about kind of getting another player that has some potential around the two established guys that they have, being Porzingis and Doncic. And I still think there's a world where Wiggins ends up being a good player and a helpful player and a good scorer, and goes back to kind of the guy that he was in his first 2 seasons. Maybe not statistically, but in terms of confidence and in terms of just his value on the floor. And any team trading for him is just banking on the fact that maybe all he needs is a change of scenery and a change in role to be able to make that happen. Now, again, this could end up being a mistake. They could end up being locked into Andrew Wiggins' deal long term, and he's not worth it at any point during the deal. But again, I just think that it would be worth it to some team when you're not giving up anything. You're giving up a second round pick and the cap space that Andrew Wiggins takes up, plus some expiring contracts. Why not take a flyer on a guy that does still have some potential and someone that could still be really good for your team? Next up now, Luis says the Timberwolves would get Serge Ibaka, Norman Powell in exchange for Andrew Wiggins and Bates Diop. And again, I don't want to say the same thing over and over again too much, but this is another team that could potentially take a flyer on Andrew Wiggins. And the Raptors are a team to keep an eye on in terms of taking on any kind of big money this offseason because they have so many expiring contracts, Serge Ibaka being one of them, where they can take on some of these bloated contracts for value in return. As Luis says, maybe they'd get a protected first out of this or maybe a couple of seconds to take on the contract of Wiggins and then hope that something works out for him. Now, it does kind of take away some of their long-term flexibility because his contract goes for another 4 years and takes up a significant amount of their cap space. But again, just like I've talked about with some of these other teams, in certain circumstances, it would be worth it to take on his deal. And these aren't the most exciting trades in the world, but these are the kinds of Andrew Wiggins trades that you can come up with that are actually realistic and reasonable that could happen over the next year as the Timberwolves prepare themselves to try and get max cap space next offseason. So again, it's a huge buy low move. I mean, you're giving up an expiring contract in Serge Ibaka, Norman Powell, who's on a long-term deal that he's not really worth, and you're getting back Bates Diop and Wiggins and maybe a pick as well. That's really good value, even though Wiggins is going to be making so much money, and it's worth taking a look at. And last up now, and this is the team that I would expect Wiggins to be traded to at some point just because it all makes sense for them. The Charlotte Hornets have already shown that they're willing to take on a good amount of money to get any kind of young future player that has some kind of potential. In the Terry Rozier situation where they worked out a sign and trade for Kemba Walker where they could get Rozier on a deal that they wouldn't have been able to sign him to on the open market as a regular free agent, but at least he gives them some kind of a future, some kind of hope that he could end up being a good player down the road because they don't really have anybody else on the roster that represents that because Kemba Walker and Jeremy Lamb both left and they're basically just counting on like Miles Bridges and Malik Monk. So this is a trade that in some combination I think is going to end up happening where the Timberwolves get Marvin Williams and Michael Kidd-Gilchrist in exchange for Andrew Wiggins. Those are both expiring deals for the Timberwolves. They get out from under Wiggins' money immediately or at least as soon as they can in the 2020 offseason. The Hornets don't really give up anything except for those expirings. Kidd-Gilchrist is kind of a useful player for them, but it's probably worth it to try a little bit more of a high upside player in Wiggins and see if he ends up developing into anything down the road. And as Luis said, maybe the Timberwolves will get some seconds so they can get some kind of value other than just the cap relief. But again, whether it's Tyler Zeller or whoever the Hornets have on the roster as a contract that can make this work, I think eventually we're going to see Andrew Wiggins in Charlotte. And it would make sense, truly. Like, I know that they already have a lot of money on the books and they're not going to be a very good team, but there is still the possibility that Andrew Wiggins ends up being a good player. He's a former #1 overall pick. He's someone that still has potential, someone that had a really good first 2 seasons in the league, and someone that Charlotte could look at and say, maybe we can turn this guy around, and maybe he can be a 20-point per game scorer for us again, and him and Terry Rozier can kind of be our future, at least the beginning of it. And I understand that that's not the most exciting proposition in the world, and it's kind of depressing to hear it like that, but that's where the Hornets are at, and that's where a couple of these teams are at that I've mentioned throughout this video, where they're either really stuck in the middle without a ton of upward mobility, or even worse in the Hornets case, they're completely capped out, they don't have a ton of young talent, and getting someone like Andrew Wiggins makes sense for them. So not the most exciting thing in the world for Hornets fans, but I think a lot of them would end up taking this where they give up expiring contracts, they take on what could be with Andrew Wiggins to at least provide them some hope, some potential value down the road without really having to give up anything. And that's going to be the basic framework of any Andrew Wiggins trade, and most specifically the Hornets. And that's the team, like I said, that in the end, I do expect him to be moved to. And that is going to be the end of today's NBA Trade Machine video, and I thank you all very much for watching. One thing that I forgot to mention in the beginning of this video that I typically do, if you would like to see your trade featured in any of these videos in the future, the best way to do that is to leave it down in the comment section of the previous Trade Machine video, in this case being this one, and then the next one I'll look down below, or you can just follow me on Twitter and pay attention to when I ask for trades over there, and that's a great way to get that done and do that as well. But like I said, my name is Tucker. I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. If you missed any of my previous videos, then be sure to check out the boxes on screen. Thanks again, and I'll see you all next time.